JavaScript code has a number of ways that you can output content and output running blocks of code using loops. So some of the more commonly used ones are the for loop, and there's also the while loop and the do while loop. So these are all very similar, where you set a default starting value, you increment the value, and then you have a way to break out of the loop. And these are all going to be outputting those values into the console, and that's what we've got within the block of code. Also, when you have arrays, there's a number of ways to get the contents out of the array. So using the for loop, the while loop, so those are all available. In addition, there are array methods such as the for each, which allows you to loop through and get each value of the items within the array. There's also a for of statement, and that also allows you to loop through and get the contents of an array. For objects, there's a for in loop that allows you to loop through and iterate through the items of the object and get those values and output them into the console. And there's also a function format where you can loop through the contents of the function code until the condition is met, and at that point then the loop will stop and it's going to stop executing the code. So that's the last example that we have. Loops provide a way to run code multiple times. Let's create some loops. So one of the most common loops is going to be a for loop. So that's going to be setting up the starting value. So we set a value for a variable of I to equal 0. And then we want to have a condition that's going to eventually allow us to break out of the loop. So looking for the condition and setting it up as I, and it's going to continue to loop through while this condition is true. So looping through while I is less than the value of 10. And then we also need a way to increment I, so eventually I is going to be greater than 10 and the loop will stop. So we do an increment of the value of I, and within the console we'll just output whatever the value of I is at the current time when this block of code is running. The block of code that's going to run is contained within the curly brackets. So saving that outputs a starting value of 0 for I, so that matches with what we've got within the let I equals 0, and then it's going to loop through, and then once I equals a value of 10, this is going to stop the loop, and that's where we end up looping until we reach 9, and we're incrementing I by 1 as we're looping through the values. There's a few other ways to do loops in JavaScript code. So one of them was the for loop. There's also a while loop. So this is going to be the similar structure where we set a initial value, such as if we're setting a value of I of 0, and then using the while keyword, and this is where we've got the condition that's going to eventually break the loop. So looping through while the value of I is less than 10, and then running the block of code where we're as well output the console content of I, and we also need a way to increment I, so incrementing I within the block of code that's running. And what that's going to do is it's going to produce the exact same results as the for loop. There's also a do while loop, and a do while loop is going to be slightly different than what we see with the while loop, whereas the do while loop will run at least one time. So if we set the value of I to be 10, this last loop is not going to run. We're only getting that first for loop. And whereas the do while loop will run through that value of I at least one time. So within the do, we have the curly brackets, and this is where the code goes that's going to be running and setting the value of I, incrementing it by 1. And then within the console, we can output whatever we have for the value of I. And then afterwards include the while statement. And this is going to be the condition that needs to be met in order for the do while loop to continue running. So this is going to actually output the content at least one time. I'm going to have the console message with the value of I before we increment the value of I. And saving that, we see that it runs at least one time. The value of I is going to be 9, which is not going to meet this condition, but because this is a do while loop, we run through it at least one time and do an increment of the value of I. So if we were to set I to 0, this would run through 9 times, just as we saw with the other one, and we don't actually reach the value of 10 for I. Loops are good for arrays. So if we had an array, and let's add in some values into the array. So add in some string values, and then a few numbers. So we have several items in the array. And because we do have a length property for the array, that means that this provides us a way to loop through the contents of the array. So let's select those items, and we can use a for loop. So let's set the value of I to be equal to 0. And then we're going to loop through while the value of I is less than the length value of the array. Increment the value of I, and we'll use the value of I as the index value for the item within the array. And that will allow us to loop through and output all of the items in the array. So there's a listing of the values of the items in the array. There's also several other ways that you can loop through array contents. We can also do it with the while loop as well. So looping through where we set a value of I, so set it to I equals 0, and then loop through while the value of I is less than array length, and we use that array length property once again in order to set the condition to break out of the loop. And just as we did within the for loop, we can use the value of I as the index value as we loop through the items of the array, and we need to also increment I. So that will produce the same results, outputting all of the values of the array. There's also array methods. So there's one that's called the for each, and that allows us to loop through the values of the items of the array. And you can get the item, you can get the index value, and you can also get the array contents. And then as you loop through, just selecting, and you can output the item or any one of these values that we've got within the loop. So you don't have to include the index or array if you're not using them. And if you are using them, you can just set a variable name for the item that is contained within the array. Loop through the items of the array using a for of statement. So we get a value of, and then the iterable item, which is going to be the array. So this is going to allow us to get through each one of the items that's contained within this array, and then we can run this block of code here. And for now, what we'll do is we'll just log out whatever we have for the value of val, and that's going to output all of the values of the items of the array. So that's another way that you can use to loop through the items of the array. A for in statement, which allows us to loop through the properties of an object. So if we did have an object that we're going to just set up a quick object here using the curly brackets. So if we want to loop through all of the items of that object, we can use the for in to loop through the object. So selecting the for and then using whatever the key value is, and then in selecting the object. And then let's console log out what we have for the key. So what that does is that loops through and selects the key of the object. So that way we can use the object itself, because we do have the key. That will allow us to loop through and get all of the values of the items in the object. There's also a way that you can loop through using a function and increment the value of x plus 1. So if x is less than 10, then we'll loop through and send the value of x back into the function. Otherwise, we can return whatever the value of x is. So this can create a function that we can loop through, and we'll just console log out the current value of x into the console. Let's start the loop. We're going to send a value, starting value of x to be 0, and that will allow us to loop through the function code, incrementing the value of x by 1. Then we're outputting the value of x afterwards in the next line of code. We have our condition in order to break out of the loop. So checking to see if the value of x is less than 10, and if it's not, then we send back into the same function object the value of x, and that will go through it again, incrementing it by 1. And if this condition is no longer true, we simply return back x. So that's another way that you can create loops And depending on what the application needs are, you could create different loops to address the different scenarios. And some of them do overlap that we're doing the same thing, such as if you're outputting values from an array, and if that's all you're doing within the loop code, there's a number of different ways to do that, as well as creating the for loops and the while loops. So go ahead and give it a try. Try out all the different ways in order to create loops, output the values into the console. You're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.